There we go. There's cookies over there, coffees in the kitchen. They were working on the kitchen all day, so we left the cookies over here. And then I have some copies of the book. Now I have a total of 10, but 2 people already bought them. That's the Collegeville commentary. The reason I got this, did you get this online?
I couldn't find it.
You couldn't find it on Amazon?
So I had to find the author of it.
Oh, Michael F. Patella, 2 L's.
Okay, thanks.
So, this is the new Collegeville Bible commentary. So they had the Collegeville Bible commentary, now they're redoing the whole series just like they're doing the Anchor Bible series, just so more people can buy more things. And the reason I use this is because there's a coordinating copy in Spanish. So, although there's actually 2 different authors, and the Spanish one is William Scott. Yes. Okay. Everything? Okay.
No, I have 20. Somebody else passed.
Okay, thank you. God bless you. Thank you. So there's a Spanish version of this. If you do have a Spanish version.
How much are they?
$10. $9.95. I'm making a nickel. Okay. Shameful.
Oh boy.
Yes, I know. Yes. Church is always looking for money. They're tax-free because we bought them as a church.
Oh, okay. We would like to get one if we only have a 20.
I want one in English. Para seguirle su día.
What language did you want? Maybe?
English?
You want an English
Yeah.
also?
I'm trying to learn.
Okay. I've got change for money. I don't have change for that one. Oh, there you go in English. Now I have change for that one. There you go. Anybody else? Okay.
I only have coins. I put that one over to see whether somebody else is putting it in.
You said English one. You said Spanish one. Oh, I got the other one. Okay, thank you. Is that? Okay, hold on. Let's see. Oh, he's got change. Good. I owe you $2. Yeah, I can do it. Here's $3.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. That goes here. This goes here. Okay. And you don't. Again, I'm just suggesting this. You don't have to buy them, but if you want to have something. Oh, okay.
2.
You want 2?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, we're paying the bill for buying all those books. Ritz will be happy that they gave her a big bill.
$10 to get one before.
Okay, the other thing that I use, and that's online, and that's kind of the base that I use, is called, it's Catholic Commentary on Scripture. And it's also a very good series, but they don't have anything in Spanish. So, and this though, the Luke's Gospel by Pablo Cadens. So, and that one I downloaded.
Who is Pablo?
Who is Pablo Cadens? A scripture scholar. Okay, that one I downloaded on Nook, so the Barnes and Noble, which you probably get on Amazon also. What is this?
No, you don't.
I don't.
Is it this?
No, the other one. I only have one of the other ones left.
Okay, so I'm paying for 2.
You're paying for 2.
But
Okay.
one for very and one for.
Yeah, but I only have one.
Okay, so we'll see.
So,
Take in Spanish one.
Here. I owe you one and you owe me $10, but I'm not gonna deal with that. Oh, okay. You don't owe me anything? I still owe you one, but you don't owe me anything. And the other one, the other kind of scholarly work is the Anchor Bible series, which I've got the old versions. They're coming out with new versions of all this too. And that's 2 volumes on Luke's Gospel, each of them being like $60 or something. So, and then this I don't think is in print anymore. This is the Pelican series, and they used to be good back when I was in college. They were kind of big on college textbooks, and that's St. Luke by Care. So those are some of the sources we're using.
And the one that you had yesterday, for what it was, the book? Lo que pasó ayer, ¿de qué era este libro? Remember yesterday?
Oh, the Divine Renovation?
Yeah.
Yes. Don't confuse me, that's yesterday.
No, that's why I said yesterday.
Yesterday's gone, you don't remember the songs? Tomorrow may never be.
Yeah, but if you don't have.
Okay, yeah, that's an entirely different thing. Okay, so Glenn, let's get to the Gospel. So Luke is the longest of the Gospels in terms of word count, not in terms of chapters. So Matthew has 28 chapters, Luke has 24 chapters, but Luke is some 19,000 words, just the Gospel of Luke. So it's a bigger Gospel than the others. Each of the chapters are longer. It's also, in some ways, more developed, and yet the stylism or the stylistic shape of the Gospel gives it a lot of critics pause, because then they think it's too much style and the substance is not there or changed or whatever. So I'm looking at all these critics and thinking, okay, you guys just seem to be fighting with each other. So they, as I said, it's most developed in terms of style. So if you had gone to the Mark's class, when we're passing out this thing, somebody mentioned today, asked me if I was going to give out a certificate if you complete all the classes. And I said I used to do that at Aloysius because that was part of this program that we had. But so if you want a certificate, then fine, complete all the classes and I'll get you a certificate. But otherwise, don't worry about it. But that's what the assignment is for. So. And we are recording this, as bad as the class has been so far. We are recording it so that if somebody wants to watch it online or can't make a class, they can pick it up again. As long as I remember to push the button at the beginning of every class. Okay, so the 24 chapters, the stylistic, and Luke's Gospel begins differently. It's part of what's known as the Synoptic Gospels. So those are the 3 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're synoptic because they align up in many ways, and many of the passages are shared between all 3 Gospels. That's why, because of the style of the writing and the words that are used, Mark is considered the earliest of the Gospels written, and in terms of how it phrases things and how it looks at things like the destruction of Jerusalem. And then Matthew and Luke are seen as contemporary. Mark written anywhere between 60 and 75 AD. And then Luke generally was considered after Matthew, but again, the scholars are all over the line here. So some of the scholars have put this as early as 60, and some scholars have put it as late as 85. So the scholars used to put it more toward 85, but some scholars are moving it earlier. And part of that is simply in trying to attach the gospel to the persons involved. So it's one of the Synoptic Gospels, and as I said, there's about a third that is shared in Luke. About a third of Luke is shared with Mark and with Matthew. And they line up, and also the kind of overall storyline lines up. So the stories are kind of told in the same way. There's another quarter of the gospel that Luke shares with Matthew, but it's not shared with Mark. And and again, if you have a parallel Bible or a parallel gospel book, that'll show you the gospels as they line up, where each of the passages kind of match each other or are close enough to each other. and then show you these huge blanks where somebody continues on with the story. So for example, in Mark's Gospel, when we're doing Mark's Gospel, we mentioned a number of stories that Mark tells that he actually develops further than the other two synoptics do. So Matthew and Luke seem to just tell the basic story, and Mark goes into this great detail. Luke, on the other hand, normally tells greater detail in his story. So there are many places where Mark is just going along the line and kind of like giving us a sense of what Jesus is doing, and Luke develops the whole story around it. Luke also has this tendency, he sets the gospel forth almost as a historical record. And because he's trying to present it as a historical record, he includes lots of other facts. Okay? So just to give you a quick example, we'll do the first sentence in Luke's gospel, which actually is 4 verses long. So it begins, since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately and new, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teaching you've received. So that's all one sentence. Yeah.
But is there any discrepancy whatsoever time-wise?
All kinds of discrepancies.
Yeah?
All kinds of discrepancies. You mean between the synoptic gospels, or between or what Luke says? Yeah, there's all kinds of discrepancies in the history. So Luke has Quirinius as governor of Syria, but Quirinius wasn't governor of Syria until after, long after Jesus was born. So he's got the time frame mixed up, and again he's adding facts, but the facts he's adding could be just kind of like local lore, trying to say, okay, so you know about this guy, so it's about this time, and you know about this person, it's about this time. So there's a number of things that Luke, even though it says I'm kind of setting them forth, there's a number of discrepancies in there that create a problem for the historicity of the gospel. Okay, and that's where you come into the question is whether or not, you know, people who look at the history and say, well, this fact isn't true, or this fact didn't happen this way, then they want to throw out everything because the details are not accurately stated. But again, kind of in a defense of that, you're telling a story some 30 to 50 years after it happened. And so if you go back and start telling a story about your childhood, you probably have it told correctly, but there are pieces here and there that you've added or combined that weren't quite like that. My mother used to catch me all the time in homilies or my articles and say, it didn't happen that way. And I said, well, when you write your own articles, then you can say how you think it happened. But,
That's true.
so yeah, so some of it may be a recall issue. Some of it, of course, is based upon what are we actually trying to convey? What's the message we're trying to convey? So sometimes you bring in facts that line up so that the message is what you're hearing, and the fact isn't as important as the message itself. Some of it may just be inaccuracies. So in the 80s, and I haven't really nailed this down in terms of the various books I've looked at as far as the class goes, but the big question is the birth of Jesus. So and we'll talk about this next time, but you have Luke's gospel telling us about the census, and that they go from Nazareth, the angel Gabriel appears to Mary in Nazareth, and Mary and Joseph go from Nazareth down to Bethlehem, where the child is born. But Matthew's gospel makes it sound like Mary was living in Bethlehem, and the child was born there, and because of the political oppression with Herod and the danger with Herod, they had to get out of Bethlehem and go out to Egypt, and then come up to, and they moved to Nazareth because it was out of Herod's territory. So you get two different things. Both of them agree that the baby was born in Bethlehem. But how they got to Bethlehem, they're in disagreement on. Okay? And then you have the question of the census. And there were census, but there's no recorded census in Caesar Augustus' time for the whole world. But there were various times that there were census taking. But just because there's no record of census by Caesar Augustus doesn't mean that there wasn't a local census. So Caesar may not have ordered it, but from the people's point of view, whatever Rahm Emanuel does, is the government. So it's Madison. Madigan does the same thing, or Pritzker, or whatever you want to say. You just kind of blame them all. Okay. So and that could be part of the reality there too. So there may have been a census, but it may not have been Caesar Augustus ordering the census. Or maybe the guy ordering the census used Augustus's name because that gave it weight to what they did. So if I tell you Cardinal Supich told me to do this, then you say, oh, well, he has to do it because Cardinal Supich told him. So there could be a lot of that going on. And we'll try and pull those out. So where the facts don't match up, or where they're not facts, and they're just kind of details in there, but they're not true to what history says, I'll try and point that out for you. If you have a question, just say it, and then we'll look at that as part of it. The other thing that happens is there's some question, not by all the scholars, but there's some question in terms of what actually is Luke's gospel, because of course there's the Bible as we have it, and then there's various papyrus. There's various manuscripts, there's various codices that are out there. And so then the question becomes, do we include this verse or not include this verse? And so someone like in the Anchor Bible series, which is a much more scholarly work, they're very worried about when they're translating something, they want to make sure they have exactly what it's supposed to be. And so they talk about other scholarly works and say, well, I'm going to include this one, and I'll tell you why I include this one, but other people don't include this one, because it's in this papyrus, but it's not in this papyrus, or it's in this manuscript. And ultimately, the two main manuscripts that form the New Testament are called codices. And one is Codex Sinaiticus, as in the Sinai Peninsula, and the other one is Codex Vaticanus, as in Vatican. So those are the two main manuscripts that form the New Testament, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. In terms of all of that, as a priest, pastor, preacher, my first thing is, this is what we got, and this is what we use. Okay? So no matter what the manuscripts or the differences in the manuscripts may be from the originals, and this one was, we can trace it back to 120 AD, or this one is only at the 180 AD. This is the one we use. So this is what we're going to go with in terms of what's actually in the Bible. So it's the same thing like when I talked with Mark's gospel. There's the shorter ending. There's where the gospel ends, and then they have the shorter ending, and then they have the longer ending. And many scholars would not even talk about them, just throw them out because they're not to the original. But they are in the Bible, so they are part of what is our scripture, so that's what we're going to go with. So when we talk about Luke's Gospel, we're going to go with what's actually in the New American Bible, the Catholic Bible, as it stands. And then the various manuscripts or whatever, we won't worry too much about. If there's something distinct that I have to kind of bring up, I will bring it up to you, but otherwise, we're dealing with the Bible, not with the manuscripts. So that's how we're going to go with it, okay? So you have the synoptic, I mentioned Matthew, Mark. So where Matthew and Luke agree, most of the scholars refer to it as possibly an oral source. They were looking for the written source, but they can't find it after years and years. So now they're calling it an oral source, and they basically call it the Quella, or the Q source. And that's simply, there must be a source of sayings, because where they agree, they're sayings of Jesus. They're not particularly stories, they're just sayings, teachings of Jesus. And Matthew and Luke have them, but Mark doesn't have them. So they figure if Matthew and Luke have them, they both got them from somewhere else. That may be true. I'm not a big believer in that, but because they don't have the source. And so, and if it's an oral tradition, well, it's just as easy to say that oral tradition landed clearly on Luke's path as well as it landed on Matthew's path, which makes it even more likely that these are actually sayings of Jesus, as opposed to something that just kind of passed along. So, and there are obviously many other sayings that thought they were sayings of Jesus, or people said were sayings of Jesus, and got into some of the other Gospels that are not in the Bible, such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And so those aren't necessarily real sayings, but that would be the other place that they say. So where they agree, they call that the Q source. Okay, there is an agreement there. And Q just stands for quella, which means source. So that's what they're referring to whenever you see that. And that's the other place of agreement. Then Luke also has, and this confuses some scholars, Luke also has parts of his gospel that line up clearly with St. John's gospel. And St. John's gospel was written much later. And so the stories of Martha and Mary, that Luke talks about Martha and Mary, John talks about Martha and Mary, the other two gospels don't talk about Martha and Mary. So, there's a couple of places where Luke lines up with John, and then there's a question, well, was this added in later? Is this part of the original gospel? How did all of this come together, or why is that in there? And again, each of the gospels are written with a point of view, and they're written with a certain amount of knowledge. And so, just because it's in one gospel and isn't in another gospel, it doesn't mean that either didn't happen. It could simply be that Mark didn't think that this story was particularly important for his message, or that Matthew didn't think that he wanted to tell this story because it didn't line up with how he's telling the message. Particularly if you look at Matthew, who's emphasized on the law, and you have Mary, who's could also be Mary Magdalene, who was the prostitute, and then, well, she's not good with the law, so let's not include her story in here. So there's all kinds of reasons why you might have a story in two Gospels that you don't have in other Gospels, besides, that they might know each other or be copying from each other. And again, I'm not a big proponent of the copy thing, simply because communication in the ancient world, while it existed, it wasn't like having Facebook or email. So they didn't have instantaneous communication, and things could happen. But you also have a group of people who actually knew Jesus and are going out talking to others. And so I might be talking to you, and Andrew might be talking to you, and we're telling you the same story, maybe slightly differently as we remember it. So then when you go to talk together, you both know the same thing. And I didn't know that he was going to tell you that, and he didn't know that I was going to tell you that. So again, it may have happened that it's just simply out there, or it may be that, oh, I read Matthew's gospel and now I'm going to put this in here. So that's part of it. Is when you're trying to line them up, the lining up could be any number of things, and not simply that there's another source out there. It could be any number of ways of lining things up. Okay, let's get to the question of who is Luke. Because you'd like to know who the author is, right? And again, there's tradition and speculation, because that's all we really have. So generally, tradition says that Luke was a physician, Greek-speaking, obviously because he wrote in such a wonderful style of Greek. And that he definitely knew St. Paul. How much he worked with Paul or did not work with Paul is unsure. But when we look at this, we have to remember that when we talk about the Gospel of Luke, it's two books here we're really talking about. We're talking about the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, because they're both written by the same person. And so, they're meant to be seen as two volumes of, in a sense, the same. They're meant to be seen as two volumes of the same kerygma, which is just the Greek word for proclamation of the gospel, or proclamation of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. So that's what they're seeing. So as Luke is proclaiming the passion of Christ and his resurrection and who Christ is, he sets it up in two volumes. One is, here's the story about Jesus, and two, here's the story about the church. And many of the stories echo each other. And also, if you look closely at Luke's gospel, many of the stories in the gospel actually echo Old Testament stories. So he's basically saying, here's what God did, here's what God did in Jesus Christ, which is so much better than what he did here. And here's what the apostles are doing, which is exactly what Jesus said they could do, and it looks to be, in a sense, so much better than we could ever imagine it would be. Because remember, the apostles, once they received the Holy Spirit, and actually the apostles did great things. Did great things, and they did miracles also. So this kerygma, this proclamation of the gospel, is seen across the entire frame of Luke's gospel and Acts of the Apostles. So the question is, how much he worked with Paul, or how much he knew Paul. Tradition would also say that Luke knew Mary. And that some of the infancy narrative actually came from knowing Mary. Again, that's tradition. This, at least, is speculation built upon the sense of what's actually in the book. This is just oral tradition saying that Luke knew Mary, still was a physician, but this was also there. And of course, if that's the case, then the infancy story from Luke would have more weight because he's getting it right from Mary. But again, we don't know that there's a census, and I'll go through that when we get to the infancy story next time. That we'll talk about why Matthew's is probably more accurate than Luke's, but we'll go through that a little bit. So this is where we're at. The other is whether or not he knew any of the other apostles, and so and that would be a question. So we talked about in Mark's gospel, we talked about Mark knowing and working with Peter, as well as knowing Paul. So Mark was on one of Paul's journeys, and Paul said, "Get him out of here. I don't want to work with him anymore." And so he went off to work with Peter. But Paul, Luke also worked with Paul, and there's places in Acts of the Apostles where it talks about we. So the narrator saying, "We did this." Basically, Paul, Silas, and someone else who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, which would be Luke. So there's some question that yes, he actually did work with him, and Paul mentions him in two of his letters as well. So that's where some of that's going to come from. And then there's a question of he's not quite the same as Paul, but again, there's a sense of Luke is most likely as he's Greek speaking, he's still most likely Jewish, although that is some question because they talk about circumcised, and that they talk about this group of circumcised Jews, and they don't include Luke in the list when Paul is talking about it. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't Jewish or he wasn't circumcised. He just wasn't in this group of people. So there's some question as to whether or not he was Jewish, but because of his knowledge of various things in terms of rituals and purification, things like that, there's at least some knowledge there. However, when he talks about Mary and Joseph going for the purification rituals, he has the rituals correct, but he doesn't have all the details correct. So the offering the pair of turtle doves, yes, that was done not for the child, but rather for the woman who had gave birth. To redeem the child, you paid 5 shekels to the priest. So, and that's how you redeem your child. So he's got the detail in there. Yes, you have to redeem the child, but it's not with the pair of turtle doves. So he's got some things mixed up again. So there's details that are facts, but aren't used the way they're supposed to be used. So that also questions whether or not how well he knew the Jewish law, or if he's just reciting things that he had heard about it and kind of putting the pieces together. One set of scholars thinks he wrote in Antioch, which would make sense. There's a huge Jewish community, a huge Christian community, an early Christian community. However, the problem with that, of course, is that Matthew also is considered written in Antioch. And so maybe that's why they knew each other, maybe that's why their Q source is right, and they were kind of sharing each other's writing. But it seems unlikely that both Gospels would come from the same city. The other is that if it was with Mary, one possibility is that he wrote the Gospel in Alexandria. Again, that's tradition, not by the scholars. So that's more like Catholic tradition, old time type stuff. Otherwise, they don't have anything other than a couple of guesses, and one of them might be something like Corinth or one of the other Greek cities, one of the cities where Paul might have worked. So, if it wasn't Antioch itself. So that's as much as they've got, obviously educated. Now the gospel is set forth as this history, kind of, let me provide you, I've investigated this stuff and I'm providing you this accurate history. And so then the question becomes now is the gospel itself a history or not? And so he sets it forth as saying, I've investigated these things, I want you to know the facts as they've been presented, as you've learned them. So here's what I'm going to give to you in this gospel. And then in Acts of the Apostles, he refers back in my earlier work. He actually addresses the gospel to a person, Theophilus. And we don't know who that is. But it sounds like he's addressing it to a specific person. In fact, it might even be a king, the way your most excellency, most excellent Theophilus. Great. And that could very well be, but they don't know who that would be in terms of people. That doesn't mean the guy didn't exist. They just don't have a record of this. On the other hand, the word Theophilus, broken back from Greek, basically means a lover of God or loved by God. So many of the early saints, like Origen and Augustine, talked about, well, if you read the gospel, Luke is specifically writing it for you because you love God. So if you are a lover of God, you're the one he's writing the gospel to. So, which could very well be, again, it could be a literary trick to say to anyone who's writing it. By setting it up this way, also it allows, in a sense, the gospel to appear almost as a letter to a person and not as a proclamation of a faith that was under attack. And so, whether it's the Jews or the Romans who said, these Christians are preaching something that is, wrong or heresy or they need to be killed for it. Well, by writing this as a letter, in a sense, he's not bringing out this gospel to everybody, but only writing to you because you're the lover of God. And so it could be a way of propagating the gospel without getting into trouble for it as well. So again, this is completely unknown as to who this is. Doesn't mean he doesn't exist, but it also could mean that he's just writing it to you because you love God and you're willing to do this. The gospel then carries on various themes because of that in terms of its presentation. The idea of it being a history or setting forth the facts, this actually follows a literary form, which then would make you question whether or not this is actually a gospel or not, because many ancient biographies were written in the same kind of style. So, let me tell you about this person that everybody honors. So you write the letter to somebody and say, okay, you're most excellent Theophilus. I'm going to tell you about this person you've heard about, and this is their biography. This is their life story. So in a sense, maybe it's not a gospel as it is a biography, is how this comes out then. So you have people like Flavius Josephus and a couple of other historians who write biographies and use that same kind of style of writing. So now you've got something else going on. The problem with calling it a biography is, well, there are some things that line up. So when these biographies were written in the ancient world, you would include something about their birth, and something wonderful had to happen at their birth, because this is a great person. So if they're a great person, it shows even when they're born. And so, of course, you have something wonderful about the birth. So you have the infancy narrative. And then, of course, you have to have, you know, something about their youth. And so here we had Jesus being lost in the temple and teaching the elders in the temple. So there's something about his youth that is also wonderful. And then you start telling, you know, and just like we have these stories about Jesus turning clay into pigeons, you know, making them come alive and things like that, you know, the little stories you tell children that they kind of show you how wonderful the young child Jesus was. So you have stories like that in those kinds of biographies, and then you start talking about their life, you know, their adult life, where they really showed their greatness. And then you have various things. And of course, here you have the miracles and things like that, which show that, as well as his teachings. Where this all falls apart, of course, is that the whole point of the charisma, the whole point of the proclamation, isn't to highlight this great Jesus. I mean, there's a number of places where he's obviously highlighted and these miracles are being shown, but it's meant to bring to conversion and, you know, and to, in a sense, to save the world. So, you know, at the very end, the apostles are to go forth to the ends of the world to preach the remission of sins. And so the biography format doesn't quite follow all the way through. And that becomes a problem in terms of just saying, oh, well, he was writing a biography. He's writing about the life of Jesus. No, it's still a gospel. It's still something more than a biography. And of course, a gospel is meant to be good news. So it's the proclamation of good news, or through the death and resurrection of Jesus. So there's something more going on. Any questions about who Luke is? Anything like that so far?
You know, what I think is that if we touch Luke, it really is manifesting that he had a good, solid knowledge of history and culture of his times. Look at the way he spelled it out.
Yes.
You know. So I think that in his commitment to the gospel, to the transcendence of the gospel, probably his years got better every day.
Yeah, he brings in the point of bringing in the details is he has a breadth of knowledge that he's bringing these things in to, in a sense, to bring you along. So if you know this, or you realize, oh, he's adding this and he's talking about this other thing that happened that I know about, then you fall into line and say, oh yes, the gospel is true because it includes, you know, we talked about this, we talked about that. So that bringing all this knowledge in, so he uses that, and his writing style is much more elevated than the other gospels. John's is in a different way. John's Greek is also very elevated in a different way, but that's actually more philosophical, John's gospel. Whereas you know, he gets into the whole prologue of John's gospel, and then the relationship with the Father, and then he talks about the sending of the Spirit. There's a whole sense of philosophy and the idea of the gnosis, the special knowledge that you have that comes in John is much more in lining up the philosophers or the really highly educated. Whereas Luke is speaking in a way that attracts people. It's like reading George Willett, in a sense. You're reading a really good writer, and you're just kind of moving along and saying, oh, they're using these big words. Luke has words in his gospel that are not used in any other part of the Bible. So his Greek is very elevated, and then you see something like this opening of 4 verses with 1 sentence. So because his Greek is so well written, he can put that together without it being incorrect. It may seem clumsy at first, but you can read through it and understand the whole sentence as you go through it. So it's a very well written. And the style changes. So he's got this one style in terms of inviting people into the sense of biography, but then he goes into, as soon as he gets toward the infancy narrative, he changes the style to echo the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. And so now all of a sudden, the way he's writing makes you think of the Greek versions of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and then he's bringing these people together. And then, of course, you know, Luke's gospel in the infancy narrative, there's 4 songs. So somehow, you know, we've come up with 4 songs out of that infancy narrative. You have the Magnificat of Mary, you have the Benedictus of Zacharias, you have the Glory to God in the highest from the angels, and then you have the Canticle of Simeon. So you have 4 songs in the infancy narrative alone. So there's this elevated style and this ability to write in ways that nobody else is writing. But that, of course, also leads some people to, some of the scholars, to push Luke off to the side and say, you know, he just flourish as opposed to substance. And that's one of the problems. If you write too well, you know, people get caught up in writing, but they don't actually understand any of the substance of what you're saying. I don't see that, but I'm looking at some of the books and it's like, really? You're going to throw him out because he writes too well for you? So that's one of the things that happens. Mark's gospel seems so simple and the Greek is so basic. And yet, as we look through Mark's gospel, we found that Mark's gospel was enormously well written and very, very complicated. It was very, very well developed in its thought structure. But because the words that were used, the vocabulary was so simple, and the sentence structure was so basic, nobody saw that for years. For centuries, they just threw Mark's gospel out as, oh, it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's one story after another, and everything's fine. And then they started looking at it and saying, oh, he does everything in triads, and then this develops into a doublet, and there's a doublet over here to match the doublet over there. And so he's balancing his gospel off, and everything falls in the fulcrum of chapter 8, chapter 9. Right in the middle of the gospel is this fulcrum that changes everything. So then all of a sudden they started looking at it and realizing that it looked very basic, and yet it was very complicated. This one, they're saying it looks very complicated, which made a lot of people look at it at first, and then they're saying, oh, well, it's just complicated as all. And I don't think that's their view. We'll go through it. We'll see the power of the gospel too. Each of these gospels are powerful in their own light. And in many ways, Luke's gospel is the best loved gospel by the people because it's got the best stories in it. So all the best stories you like in the gospels are in Luke. Other than the Magi, all the rest of the Christmas story is really Luke. The ones that we tell everybody. The prodigal son, the good Samaritan, those are Luke. So all the really best stories are Luke's stories. So anyway, as we go through, we'll see all that. The format then. Let's see if we can go through some of this. So the basic format of Luke's gospel follows the main kind of theme is this journey sense. So, which is why I call the class Journeying to Jesus. So, the gospel has its prologue, which was that first 4 verses about how wonderful Theophilus is, and I've investigated all this. And then it goes into the infancy narratives. And again, there's a whole lot to be had in the infancy narratives. And there's things that match, as I said, they match the Old Testament, they match the Septuagint. You've got the 2 main characters, you've got John the Baptist and you've got Jesus, and they echo each other, but they also echo some of the earlier characters from the Old Testament. So, you've got Zechariah and Elizabeth who are old and can't have children, but you remember Abraham and Sarah are old and they couldn't have children, and God gave them a child. And then you have Hannah and her husband couldn't have children, God gave her a child. So again, it's that sense of, it's just kind of an echo of these other things. But you have the infancy narrative with the 2 characters, and whatever happens with John happens more so with Jesus. So it's like, one example would be that John grew in age and grace. Jesus grows in age, grace, and wisdom. So John does this, Jesus does this a little bit more. And then you get into the public ministry. And as you go through the public ministry with Jesus, we kind of go backwards here. So at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, we have the genealogy. So he begins that gospel with the genealogy. Let me tell you the background of Jesus so you know who it is. Mark, of course, doesn't do that. John gives us this genealogy, which is really a retelling of the Genesis creation. Luke, on the other hand, saves the genealogy till later in the gospel. After he begins the public ministry, then he kind of backtracks and says, oh, now let me tell you something about how it all began. So the moment of public ministry, after the infancy narratives, the moment of public ministry, of course, is again this setting up of John and Jesus. So you've got John going out, and he's the baptizer, and he's preaching the kingdom of repentance, and he's out in the desert, and people are coming to him. And then Jesus goes out to him, is baptized, and now Jesus begins this ministry, and again, preaching the kingdom of repentance, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So again, it kind of moves, but the whole focus then shifts away from John at that point. But that's the beginning of the public ministry. So after Jesus is baptized, goes and has his temptation, his 40 days in the desert, he comes up and he begins his public ministry by quoting Isaiah with his going back to the synagogue at Nazareth. Sorry about my handwriting. You'll get used to it after a couple of weeks. So he goes back to the synagogue where he takes the scroll of Isaiah, unrolls it, and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, therefore he has anointed me. And so that begins his public ministry. If you remember, the first preaching that Jesus does in Matthew's Gospel is the Sermon on the Mount. So he gathers his disciples up there, and then he begins. It's after the synagogue that he then goes and calls the disciples, whereas in Matthew he calls them first, and then he gathers them up for the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus goes first back to his home synagogue, where after he does this wonderful sermon at the beginning, and then he starts talking to them, kind of explaining what he was reading. Then everybody gets mad at him, which is why I don't go home to preach. I stay here. Everybody gets mad at him. They're ready to throw him out. They're ready to throw him over the top of the hill. And so then Jesus goes back, and he moves from there, and he goes up to Capernaum. And let's go back to that just for a second. So here's a map of Palestine in Jesus' time. We're going to try and make this bigger. So we've got Nazareth over here on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, out in the hill country. Okay, Capernaum is up here at the top of the sea. So, and the territory of Herod was over here. So you've got Nazareth, Cana, the wedding at Cana, all that. So you've got kind of Herod's territory. Actually, there were Herod the Great, when Jesus was born, he had 3 sons, and the territory was divided between them. And then Jerusalem itself, which is down here, was ruled by Rome at that point after another rebellion. But Jesus moves up here, and Capernaum is along a Roman route, and so Capernaum is at the edge of Syria, and northern Israel here. So basically, Jesus, what happens as he gets into trouble in one place, he steps over to the other side, and he's safe again because he's in another country. And then when he gets in trouble over there, he steps back, and he's safe again because he's in another country. So he moves back and forth a lot up here in this area, and that becomes his kind of home base. Which, sorry about that. So that becomes his home base, as opposed to down here, where he's solidly in Herod's territory and solidly in danger for his preaching. Make sense? Okay. So, but then, bring this down again. So the whole mission in Luke then, ultimately, is this sense that Jesus is going to journey from here down to Jerusalem. So remember, he's the last thing we heard of Jesus is in the temple, teaching the elders. That's when he's like 12 years old. We don't see Jesus again in Jerusalem until he goes down, in a sense, to die. So there's most of his ministry is up here, and he moves down. The other Gospels, John has Jesus in Jerusalem 3 different times, which is why we often think of Jesus' ministry as 3 years. But if you look at the Gospels, it could be anywhere from 18 months to 3 years if you're trying to figure out the time frame as far as Jesus. Actually, anywhere from 18 months to 42 months, trying to figure out the time frame of Jesus' Gospel by adding up what's in the Gospels themselves, all 4 of them. But Luke has this journey theme that brings Jesus from here to here. And that's all part of it. So the public ministry, the public ministry begins in the synagogue, it moves to Capernaum, and that's along the Sea of Galilee where he then calls his disciples. There's a synagogue in Capernaum, and Peter's house is across the street from the synagogue. So why does Jesus go for breakfast at Peter's house? Because it's right across the street. Why not? You know, it's like going over here to West River. You know, it's right there. Why not go for breakfast? So, that's one of the nice things. And that actually happens before the real call. So Jesus probably knew Peter and Andrew on a social level, or at least in the synagogue level, long before he actually called them to follow him. So, and we can get into some of that too, but so there's some knowledge of the apostles, at least of those first four, James and John, Peter and Andrew, before they were actually called to be apostles to follow Jesus. They at least were friends probably, or knew each other on a certain level. So from the synagogue, from the public ministry to the synagogue, then to the preaching ministry, and the preaching ministry then is proclamation of the kingdom, but in a number of lights. And Luke uses a number of titles for Jesus, and each one of these then develops who Jesus is. So we have Jesus as obviously the Son of God, which comes up, and this comes up in the infancy narrative too. You have him as Messiah. You have him as Redeemer, which ends up being kind of, in a sense, the end title for him, because you're going to go out and preach for the redemption of sin. Okay? You have him as Son of Man, which is always the title Jesus uses for himself. And then you have various aspects of Jesus' theology. And again, that's seen all the way back even into the infancy narratives. As you look at the Magnificat, you look at the Benedictus, you get hints of Jesus' philosophy or basic theology, which of course is a preferential option for the poor. Okay, so the poor are lifted up, the rich are thrown down, the powerful lose their power. So preferential option for the poor. Forgiveness. And then, in a sense, a new day. And much of the miracles are seen in they're seen in not necessarily a battle, but certainly a confrontation with Satan. So there's a conquering of Satan, in a sense, in the gospel. And so one of the powerful lines in Luke's gospel, when the Pharisees accuse him of curing the sick by using, or expelling demons by using the prince of demons, he says, if that's true, that's fine. But if I do it by the finger of God, then you better listen. And so there's that question, is this Satan's work or is this God's work? And of course, he's always showing us that it's God's work. So with many of the miracles are cast in that sense of, this is Satan's work. Satan has kept you bound, and now you're released. At a certain point in the gospel, and Luke, the Greek says it very clearly, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem. Okay, he and in the English translation it just says he turns toward Jerusalem, or he heads toward Jerusalem. But the Greek says it as he sets his face toward Jerusalem, with the understanding that he's not turning back. So then there's this, after this kind of ministry up along the Sea of Galilee, he moves toward Jerusalem. Okay, and that's, whereas Mark, the pivotal moment is Peter's confession of faith, and then you have the transfiguration, everything, that's the fulcrum of everything, and it moves from there. This is that pivotal moment that Jesus has been doing all this ministry, he's been doing all these miracles. None of that really matters, because now he's going to head to Jerusalem. And of course, he has one purpose in mind, because this is the only time he's heading to Jerusalem, where the other Gospels have him going back and forth at various times. This is the only time he's heading to Jerusalem. He has one purpose in mind, and that is, of course, to die for our sins. So he sets his face. And you don't just go from Galilee and then, you see him in Jerusalem. There's the travel log, in a sense. So now you have this travel log that goes along as he heads south. And you never go down to Jerusalem, even though it's down on the map. You always go up to Jerusalem because it sits on a mountaintop. So he sets his face to head up to Jerusalem. So even though the land is actually higher there, but you go down into the valley, and then you have to come back up the mountain to get to Jerusalem. And so you have the whole set of miracles and teachings that come along the travelogue. And those are built along predictions of the Passion, as well as encounters with people in terms of miracles and freeing them. Whereas, so Matthew's Gospel is built on 5 discourses, and each of them are surrounded by miracles or highlighted by miracles and a teaching. Luke's Gospel is set, here's the ministry teaching up here, here's the travelogue, there's teaching in there, and then of course there's the teaching in Jerusalem itself, and so then there's the time in Jerusalem. And like in Mark's Gospel, so Mark is very clear that Jesus spent 1 week in Jerusalem at the end of his life, and kind of gives us every day of that week. In the same way, we find Jesus constantly teaching in the temple. So whereas here he was teaching in all kinds of places, now as he goes to Jerusalem, he goes to the temple to teach, and he has a number of times that he teaches into the temple. And then of course there's his Passion, his Last Supper, the rest, suffering, death, resurrection. And so then you have the resurrection scenes. Sorry. What happened? Okay, let's try that again. In the resurrection, the stories, again, in the resurrection, like John's Gospel, they're more in detailed than they are in the others. So Mark, if you were to stop Mark here at the end of the Gospel, you just have an empty tomb. And then you get a resurrection story in the longer ending. But it's not much in terms of the resurrection story. John, you've got breakfast by the sea. You got the Easter night where they were given the power to forgive sins. You got breakfast at the sea, and then you've got the commission. In Luke's Gospel, you've got Easter. You've got Easter morning, and this is where another place where John and Luke come together. They both have Peter running to the tomb. So Matthew and Mark don't talk about Peter running to the tomb, but Luke does have Peter running to the tomb. And then you've got Peter running to the tomb. You got the empty tomb story, Peter running to the tomb. Then you've got the story of Emmaus, and the 2 disciples are on the way, and Jesus is talking to them. But then they come back, even though it's dark at night. They come back to find the other disciples gathered together, and then they say that Jesus has appeared to Peter. So somewhere in the middle of the day, while Jesus was walking with the others, he was also talking to Peter. And then at the same time, then at that moment, you have Jesus appearing again, and then he eats the piece of cooked fish. Because of course you don't want to eat uncooked fish. So he eats a piece of cooked fish, and then appears again to give them the commission to go forth and open their minds, and then give them the commission to preach the forgiveness of sins. So you have a much more developed resurrection. Not just the resurrection, but the stories that follow it. So that kind of covers kind of an introductory aspect of what we're looking at. Now, I was mentioned by someone who didn't come to the class tonight that 6:30 is hard to do. And so would 7 o'clock be a better time, and we can do it at 7 o'clock on Tuesdays? Is that all right? Or is that too late? No. So we'll keep the English class on Tuesdays at 7 o'clock, and I'll move the Spanish class to Thursdays at 7 o'clock. And rather than trying to do them both in the same night. Okay, I'll see if the Spanish can do it on 7:30 or not. We'll find out. But anyway, we'll move the Spanish class to Thursday nights. Any questions? Then we're set for now. What you wanted? Yes.
Yeah, at first you mentioned a year.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned a year that the gospel was written. Luke.
The year? Oh, yeah. Well, it was it's all over the place. So So the earliest date possible is 60.
60.
And part of that is because Acts of the Apostles talks about Paul's arrest, which happened about 62. And so the possibility, again, presuming that they were written close together, or that this was written before Acts of the Apostles, but the way Acts of the Apostles is written, it sounds like it's happening, contemporaneously with the writing. So that's why some scripture scholars want to put it earlier. But that's really early. And then you have the question of, most scholars say that Matthew and Luke took from Mark's gospel, took the basic form from Mark's gospel, and then changed it. In which case then, Mark's gospel wouldn't have been written as early as 60. It was probably more like 65 to 70. So, or 65 to 75. So then you have that question of, well, did they take from Luke? Did they take from Mark? Or is this written later? Many authors would put it between 75 and 85. And many scholars want to keep to the older date and put Matthew ahead of Luke in terms of how they set it up. And part of that, I think, is just the way that the two Gospels develop. Matthew is much closer to a Jewish understanding, Jewish law, and so they, in a sense, they want to say people were bound by their Judaism first, and as more and more non-Jews became Christians, they felt more free to kind of give up that binding to the law. Luke doesn't give up the law, but he's less attached to it than Matthew is. That could just be the places where they wrote. And again, that doesn't necessarily hold water, but that's the thinking of the scholars, and that's why they're doing that. If 70 is when they destroyed, when the Romans came and conquered Jerusalem again and destroyed Jerusalem. So 70 is that pivotal year. And then the question is, well, if Luke talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, then he wouldn't know about it until it was done, so it has to be after 70. But it could be a prophecy, and prophecies you don't necessarily have to know about. And the way Luke talks about it sounds like the way the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC. So, there's, even though Luke is much more detailed about the destruction of Jerusalem, it doesn't sound much different than what the Babylonians did. So maybe it was written as early as 60. But no matter where you date it, again, we don't have a copy of it with a date on it, because the earliest copies that we have, the papyri that we have, the manuscripts that we have are fragments. So the earliest kind of, in a sense, full copy is not until the year 2 something. And so it's not until the 3rd century that we actually have a full copy of the gospel as we see it now. And so the fragments that we have, then it's a question of, well, when exactly was this written? Because there's no dates on it. And carbon dating doesn't give you accuracy to a year. They can usually get you as far as, maybe they can get you into a decade, but even that, but we don't know when these papyri were, and the papyri are just remnants of something that could be earlier than that. So that's the problem. So the most common date that's given for Luke is 80, or 80 to 85, and then Matthew is 75 to 80, and then Mark is 70. But as I said, there's a range, anywhere from 60. Again, if you want to do the thing about Paul and his arrest in Rome, it could be as early as 60, and then probably not later than 85. But again, we don't have a life of Luke like we have of Peter or Paul. So we know when Peter died, we know when Paul died, and so we have those dates clear. So we would know that if they wrote something, it had to be at this point. And of course, Peter died in 63, I think it was. So Mark took his gospel from Peter, his primary source for the gospel. So Mark wouldn't have written before, much before 60 or so. But he might have written after Peter died, but again, right in that time frame, which is why it said as earlier. But we don't have that sense of Luke in a lifespan that says, oh, then it had to be at this point at the latest, or this point at the earliest. All we have is a sense of who he is, and not an actual body to hang it onto. Yeah.
Sense of who he is, you forgot artist.
Oh, I did forget artist. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. no, don't do anything, we're gonna make Windows better. No, don't do that. Hopefully they won't do that. Anyway, we're done for this class. I just have to get started again for the next class. So, any other questions? I don't know if I answered that question, just kind of kicked it down the road, but that's all the answer we have for it. And artists, yes, very much so. And artists, actually, again, going back to the tradition thing, one tradition is that Our Lady of Czestochowa was painted by St. Luke. So, that's an ancient tradition that says that Luke was a painter for Czestochowa.
When did they officially start using BC for years?
When did they start officially using BC for years?
Yeah.
Well, not until after Jesus was born.
Yeah, I realize that, but
No, I think it came in with the Gregorian calendar. So when Pope Gregory redid the calendar, they set it up and used BC. And of course, we say BC. Well, in today's language, they say BCE. So before the Common Era is how they want to say it. But it's not a Common Era; it's a Christian era technically. They just don't want to use the word Christ. And so then they say CE for Common Era and BCE for before the Common Era. But it's before Christ and in the year of our Lord. So that really came with the Gregorian calendar more than as far as officially. But that's kind of falling out of style because people are trying to get this BC, and many of the scholarly works will go back to that just because people will immediately dismiss them if they don't use the jargon of today. And I refuse to do that, so I continue to use BC and go ahead and dismiss me if you like, but the truth is still the truth. So
I have a good news Bible.
good for you.
It says today's English version.
Right.
Am I in there?
That's a bad translation. You gotta put it down plain. And the reason it's a bad translation is it's an English translation of another English translation. And so what happens is they took the Revised Standard Version or the King James Version and then put it down as much as possible to like a third grade level. And then so what happens is when you take words that are big words and try to turn them into small words, sometimes you lose meaning or you lose complicated aspects.
Sometimes I don't see a lot of, can I say, spiritual words?
Right, because they're trying to write for third graders. And the translation is not from the originals, but rather from another English translation. It's one of the things, and they actually have a Spanish version of that Bible too, which means they took the English translation, dumbed it down to make it for third graders, and then turned it into Spanish, which means you're translating from a translation from a translation. So the mistakes are all over the place in terms of the originals, and the depth of the language is missing. So, as you said, there's a number of words that you don't see in there because it doesn't have the depth of language. But unfortunately, even the New American is written at a 7th grade level, the one we use at church. But this Revised New American, in order to try and get closer to American vocabulary, they left out words that, again, they changed words that had better meaning and tried to give it to a more common parlance. And so that's why a lot of times at Mass rail against the translation and say, the other translation said this, because the word is much richer in meaning than the word that's being used. And sometimes when I'm reading the Gospel, I'll just read it, from memory in the old translation because I don't like it. So. Yeah. The regular the New American Bible was the original, and then they revised it. So now they call it the NABRE. Whereas they were calling it the RNAB, now they're calling it the NABRE. So New American Bible Revised Edition. Yeah. Which is what the bishops pick to use for Sunday readings at Mass with the American bishops. And it's really a bad translation, but the whole group of them, all 300 of them are sitting there, and somebody says, well, let's use this, and they're not all looking at it. And then afterwards, like Dr. Cardinal George and say, why would you guys pick this translation? It's off. He said, yeah, we didn't really think it through. You know, it's like Congress, you know, everybody votes on it and they didn't read the bill. So that's kind of what happened. The problem was the Jerusalem Bible, the original Jerusalem Bible, which has also gone through a retranslation or revision. They took, whenever they had the name of God listed in the Bible in the Old Testament, they just turned it into Yahweh, because that's the name of God. So, but the various names of God in there are very powerful and wonderful, but they just turned them all into Yahweh. The New American, on the other hand, turned them all to Lord. So wherever it said Yahweh, it made Lord with capital letters. And wherever it said Lord, it just made Lord. So you know, one went one way and the other one went the other way, and neither one of them is correct. So that's one of the problems, is that there wasn't another real good translation out there, other than the Protestant ones, which, like the Revised Standard Version, is a very good translation from the originals. But they didn't want to get caught using our Protestant theologians. so they took a bad version rather than use the Protestant version, which is a shame.
But the Protestant version wouldn't have all the books in it.
Well, but no, they do translate that. I mean, like, you can get the Revised Standard Version with what they call the Apocrypha, with the Catholic books.
Oh.
But you know, again, it was just that shame of having to
surrender.
Having to surrender, that you actually did a better job than we did.
Yeah.
But of course, the Protestants do a lot better job on evangelizing than we do. They do a lot better job on communication than we do. You know, they got the Bible online long before we did, and yet there's so many more of us. So how come we can't put that work out there? But they do a lot of things, and which is why people convert and stuff, because they reach out in a lot of ways. So doesn't make them right, but they do a good job. Whereas we just stand around and let our phones drop on the floor. Okay. Thank you very much. So not next week, not the 15th, but the 22nd is when we'll start the classes then, okay? Because next Tuesday I have the Escapula celebration. So that's why we didn't have anything there. I wanted to check the time. So 7 o'clock on Tuesday the 22nd is the next class. It'll be the bulletin, there'll be the announcements. But just so you all know, okay? So you get basically, and you want to look at chapters 1 and 2. Okay? How far we'll get, I'm not sure.